If you're trying to conceive and quietly wondering if life can be whole without a baby, feeling anxious, uncertain, or weary in your faith, you're not alone. Welcome to the Infertility and Trying to Conceive podcast for Christian women. I'm Linda Renee, an Aussie wife, mum, and follower of Jesus. Here I share biblical truth, simple conception tips, offer emotional support, and have honest conversations about what struggling to conceive really looks like as a Christian woman. My prayer is that this podcast lightens your load, keeps you anchored in Christ, and helps you move forward with confidence, peace, and hope. Christ goes before you, and I'm right here helping you look to Him every step of the way. Let's begin. Hi, and welcome back to the podcast. Today's episode is a simple one, but it actually can be quite hard to do, and that's advocating for yourself. I want to go through 10 things that you're allowed to say to your care provider, and I want to say up front that these apply whether or not you're sitting across from a GP or a fertility specialist, a naturopath, or any other kind of holistic practitioner. This isn't only about the medical world, although the medical world does tend to have systems and protocols and ways of doing things that can make you feel like you're just supposed to follow along, agree, and keep moving. But these 10 things apply anywhere that you're receiving care. Because I think sometimes too, you tend to go into these appointments and don't always end up saying what you actually want or need to say. And I think that's especially the case if you're doing fertility treatment with a specialist or at a clinic. And there are a lot of reasons for that. Have you ever walked out of an appointment and realised that you didn't really actually even take in what was said, or you agreed to something without fully understanding it, or you just felt carried along with the process, expected to go along with things without actually having time to think through all of the complexities? And you don't want to seem difficult. You don't want to ask too many questions. You don't want to come across as emotional or uninformed. And I think a lot of the time you stay quiet and you just nod and go along with what they say. And part of what makes that easy to do is that the people caring for you are on home turf. They know how this works. They have their protocols, their standard procedures, and the ways things are done. They're the ones delivering the information, but you're the one that it's actually happening to. You're the one living with the outcome. And that's a very different experience even when you're sitting in the same appointment. And this, I think, is worth saying early. There's no one-size-fits-all approach here. Not in medicine, not in holistic care, not in any of it. All of these things, they're part of who you are and they need to be addressed in the conversation. What you need, what you're uncertain about, and what you're convicted by. And I think too, as Christian women, some of the very things that have shaped how you live and how you treat people, the desire to be gentle or not cause trouble or to think of others before yourself, that can actually make it harder to speak up in a room like this. And those aren't bad, but gentleness and speaking up, they actually aren't in conflict. It's just easy to confuse gentleness with silence. So today is about giving you a bit of ground to stand on before you walk in that door. So let's get into it. So the first thing, and I really think this is probably the most basic, is simply this. Asking the question, can you explain that again? And despite it sounding simple, a lot of women don't say it. They don't want to seem like they're not keeping up, or they feel like they're taking up too much of the doctor's time, or they just feel a bit embarrassed to ask. And there's something else going on too, I think. When you're in a medical setting and someone who likely knows more than you about the medical perspective of fertility is talking, it's easy to assume that if you don't understand something, that it's your problem to sort out quietly. So, you just nod, you take the brochure, you go home and then you Google it at midnight and you end up feeling more confused and more anxious than when you walked in. But your doctor explaining things clearly, that's not a courtesy. It's actually part of their job. So it has nothing to do with intelligence or anything like that. It's about them providing you with a service, one that may also be very expensive with a lot riding on it. And you need the information in a form that you can actually use to make a good and wise decision. You're also allowed to say, can you write this down for me? Or can you draw me a diagram? Or can you point me to something that I can read at home? Whatever works for you. You likely know how you take in information, but your doctor doesn't unless you tell them. And your husband may likely be with you in appointments, but if he's not, perhaps consider asking a friend who isn't as emotionally invested in this as you. Someone who might be able to think a bit more objectively and ask the questions you might find hard to ask yourself. Having someone in the room as an advocate can be really valuable. So it's totally valid to stop someone and say, "Can you slow down and explain that again?" as many times as you need to. And along those same lines, because I think this happens a lot in appointments, is something a little bit different, but it's just as important, and that's saying, "I need a minute." Sometimes you get news in an appointment and the doctor keeps moving on to the next thing. The steps, the referrals, the tests, and what happens now. And you're still back at the last thing that they said. You're sitting in information overload and you're just trying to make sense of what you just heard. And you haven't had enough space to catch up to the next thing. You might be nodding, but you're actually not taking in what they're saying. And you might end up agreeing to things or absorbing information in a numb or frozen state. Your brain kind of just goes offline. And then you get home and you can't remember what was said, or you realise that you agreed to something that you're not actually sure about, or you just feel completely overwhelmed and you don't even know why. And there's actually a whole reason why your brain does this when it's stressed and overwhelmed. But I think part of what makes it worse is that these appointments, they tend to have a pace to them, and it can feel rude to interrupt. There might be another 5 people waiting after you in the waiting room, and you don't want to be the one that holds everything up. Fertility medicine is its own world with its own vocabulary, and so when it's unfamiliar, it takes time to process. And you're allowed to need a moment just to catch up. That's being human. So you can stop them and you can just say, "I need a minute," and that's enough. Now the next one is worth considering as a Christian, and that's, there are some things I won't consider, and I want you to know that up front. Saying this can feel like you're being difficult before anything has even happened, like you're walking in with a list of objections before anyone has done anything wrong. And so a lot of women wait. They let the appointment unfold and hope the issue doesn't come up, or they agree to something in the room and then just go home and later feel uneasy about it. But by the time a treatment option is on the table, things are already moving. The doctor's recommended it. Maybe a referral's been made. Maybe you already started hoping that it will work. And saying no at that point can feel much harder than it would have at the beginning. If the Bible and your faith shapes what you're willing to do, and I'd say for the majority of you who are listening that that's the case, it's a good idea to let your doctor know from the start. And that's not because you owe them an explanation of your faith, but it actually helps them look after you better. If they don't know where you stand, they can't factor it into what they recommend. You might end up being pointed towards options that were never going to work for you, and that costs time and money and your emotional energy. And I want to say something about this because I think it can be a real concern. Speaking up about your faith in a medical setting can feel really exposing. You might worry about being judged or treated differently, or that the doctor will take you less seriously and think you're some kind of religious fanatic. And that's not an unreasonable fear. People don't always understand where you're coming from, especially not Christians. And so there's often a difference in perspective that makes the conversation harder. And the Bible's pretty honest about the fact that not everyone will understand or respect your convictions. That's not something to be surprised by, but it's also not a reason to stay quiet about what matters to you, especially when it affects decisions that carry real weight. God gives us responsibility over the decisions that we make, and although at times, especially in this space where you're having to make big decisions, sometimes on a monthly basis, it can feel like a burden. But when so many aspects of this journey feel like they're beyond your control, being able to speak up and make choices in line with your beliefs and values is actually a gift. It means these decisions belong to you. You get a say in what you do. And so taking them seriously, being honest about where you stand from the beginning, is a way that you can be a faithful steward of that responsibility and not feel like you're at the whim of a system that keeps moving whether or not you agree. And so taking them seriously and being honest about where you stand from the beginning is a way that you can be a faithful steward of that responsibility and not feel like you're at the whim of a system that keeps moving whether you agree with everything or not. And related to that, and something a lot of women want to do but often feel awkward about, is getting a second opinion. A lot of women don't ask for this because they think that their doctor will assume that they don't trust them. So they stay quiet even when something in them is saying that they're not sure. not sure about the diagnosis they've been given, or about the recommended treatment, or about whether this is really the right path for them. But here's something to remember. Doctors get second opinions too. It happens all the time, especially in complex cases. And in fertility care, where treatments are expensive, emotionally costly, and not always straightforward, getting another set of eyes on your situation makes good sense. A second opinion might confirm what you've already been told, and honestly, that confirmation is valuable in itself. Or it might open up an option that you hadn't heard about or considered yet. Either way, you're better off for having asked, and you're allowed to ask. A good doctor won't have a problem with it. And if they do, that's actually useful to know about the person who's supposed to be caring for you. Getting a second opinion isn't saying that you think your doctor is wrong. It's saying this matters enough to you that you want to be sure that you've done your due diligence. That's not a lack of faith in your doctor. It's just being wise, considered, and careful. Now, this next one is about slowing down the whole thing a little bit and giving yourself permission to not just keep moving. And that's saying, what are all my options, including doing nothing right now? Because there's often a lot of pressure in the process to keep moving, to always be doing the next thing. And some of that pressure comes from the medical side, but I also think a lot of it comes from inside us, because the waiting feels unbearable and doing something feels like you've got some form of hope. What's worth noticing is that the pressure to keep moving can quietly take the decision-making out of your hands. You go from one appointment to the next, one cycle to the next, and at some point you realise that you haven't actually stopped to ask whether or not this is still what you want to be doing. The process just carried you. Asking for the full picture, including the option of pausing, puts the decision back where it belongs. It also means you actually know what you're choosing between rather than just being told what the next step is. Your doctor's job is to give you the information, and your job is to make the decision. Those are two different things, and it's worth keeping them separate when you're sitting in that room. A good doctor will respect that decision. They'll lay out the options, including ones that are less involved, and let you weigh them up. Pausing is a real option. Waiting is a real option. And you're allowed to ask for it to be on the table. And on the topic of understanding what you're being recommended, this next one is a question that applies whether you're seeing a doctor, a specialist, or a holistic practitioner. And that's saying, what's this based on? A lot of women don't feel like they're allowed to ask this because the person sitting across from them is meant to be the expert. There's a power dynamic in the room, and it can be hard to question something when you don't really feel like you know enough to push back on it. But there's a difference between trusting your practitioner and just accepting everything they say without understanding why. And this question isn't necessarily pushing back. It's just asking for the reason behind what's being recommended to you. Is this being based on research? Is it based on their clinical experience? Is it what they'd recommend to most people in your situation, or is it specific to you? Those are all legitimate things to ask and to know, because understanding what's behind a recommendation helps you to work out whether it fits your situation. A practitioner who has a particular interest in a specific approach or whose values align with yours might actually be pointing you towards something that's a really good fit, even if it's newer or less mainstream. And that's worth knowing too. Any practitioner worth their salt should be able to tell you what their recommendation is based on. And if they can't, or if they seem bothered that you asked, that's worth paying attention to. It's also worth remembering that research is one input into a decision, but not the whole picture. As Christians, we're bringing something else into the room with us, a set of convictions and principles that don't always map neatly into what the evidence says. And you're not being anti-science or anti-research by holding both of those things at once. Research is carried out by people, interpreted by people, and funded by people. And people have assumptions, blind spots, and agendas. That doesn't make research worthless, it's genuinely useful. But just be mindful that it doesn't get to have the final say. Make sure what God's word says does. Now this next one is one that I think a lot of women push past, partly because it feels too personal to say out loud in a clinical setting. And that's, I'm not coping and I need some support. There's something about a medical appointment that can make you feel like you should hold the emotional side of things together and just deal with the clinical stuff. Like the doctor is there for your body and your feelings should just be kept to yourself. But that's not actually how it works. What's happening to you emotionally and spiritually is connected to what's happening physically. Chronic stress affects your body. Grief affects your body. Feeling alone in this affects your body. And a good doctor will want to know how you're actually going, not just what your hormone levels are doing. A lot of women are going through infertility and are carrying this quietly. They haven't told many people. They're going to work and to church and to family events, and they're holding it together. And the one place they could actually say something is a medical appointment. And they don't say it there either. It does depend on the setting and who you're seeing. Some practitioners will refer you for more support, which is worth asking about. Some fertility clinics require at least one counselling session, but these are often fairly generic and with little time to actually get to know you. It's almost just like ticking a box rather than providing genuine support that actually makes a difference in everyday life. And yet the need is real, because research has shown that women going through fertility treatment experience similar levels of stress to those with a cancer diagnosis. And that's not a small thing to carry, and it deserves to be taken seriously by you and the people looking after you. You're allowed to say that you're struggling. You're allowed to ask what support is available, a counsellor, a referral, a support group, whatever that looks like in your situation. You don't have to have it together in that room, and you're allowed to be honest about where you're at. And very much connected to that is the next one, and it's probably one of the hardest on the list, is to actually say, I don't feel heard and I need you to listen to me. It's direct and it risks making the appointment uncomfortable. But here's what's worth considering. If you've left multiple appointments feeling like your concerns were brushed past, or like your doctor had already decided what you needed before you walked in, that feeling is telling you something. You're not being oversensitive. Something is actually not working in that dynamic, and it matters. Not just for how the appointment feels, but for the quality of your care. Doctors are human. Some of them are overworked. Some of them have a particular way of doing things and don't always slow down enough to check whether it fits the person in front of them. Some of them are just not a good match for you. None of that makes it okay, but it does mean that sometimes you have to be the one to say something. You can say, I don't feel like I'm being heard and I need that to change. It doesn't have to be a big confrontation. Your doctor can't look after you well if they don't understand your situation, and they won't understand your situation if they're not actually listening to you. Saying something is not making a fuss. It's doing what you need to do to get looked after properly. This might be your GP, it might be a specialist, whoever it is, you need them to actually listen to you, and it's okay to say so. The next one is saying, I'm feeling a bit overwhelmed. Can we slow this down? This is different to needing a minute to process information. This is about everything that happens in the appointment, feeling like it's too much to keep up with. The pace of everything, the amount of what you've been told, and everything being moved along at a speed that doesn't give you room to think. Fertility appointments can be a lot, and there's often medical information, test results, treatment options, costs, timelines, sometimes all in one appointment. And if you're already running on empty emotionally, taking all of that in one sitting is genuinely hard. There's also the very real pressure of knowing that every appointment costs money and that time feels like it's always working against you in this process. So pushing through and just nodding along can feel like the responsible thing to do. And that pressure is real. It's not imagined and it's not small. But if you're not actually taking it in, you're not getting the value of the appointment anyway. And going home with half the information or the wrong understanding of something important can end up costing you more, emotionally and practically, than taking an extra 10 minutes in the room would have. You're allowed to say, I'm feeling a bit overwhelmed. Can we slow this down? Or can we focus on just one thing today? Or can we book another appointment to go through the rest of this? You likely know what you can handle. Your doctor doesn't unless you tell them. And if you've been navigating infertility for a while, appointments can carry a lot of emotional weight before you even walk in the door. You know, the last result, the last cycle, the last piece of news, it's all sitting with you in that room. And sometimes the overwhelm, it's not just about the information, it's about everything that's accumulated. And it's okay to say that too. You don't have to pretend that you're walking in fresh every time. And the last one, number 10, is this: I'm not ready to decide yet. There's an aspect of this journey where you just keep moving from one thing to the next because stopping feels too hard. At some point, you might reach a place where you're thinking to yourself, I really haven't chosen much of how the medical side goes, and I've just gone along with it. And I think it's really worth slowing down and taking the time to work through where you stand on things as a couple and biblically, rather than just being carried along by a clinic's schedule or the pressure that time is running out. These decisions have real weight, not just medically, but personally, spiritually, for your marriage, for how you feel about yourself and this whole process. And they matter before God too, because following Him involves making choices that honour Him and that line up with what He says in His Word. They deserve more than just going along with the next recommended step because the process carried you there. You're allowed to sit with your doctor and say, I'm not ready yet, and maybe not even at all. It's okay to get to a point where this no longer sits comfortably with you. A good doctor will tell you if there's anything time sensitive that you need to know about, and then give you room to think. Taking time to work through things is not stalling. It's what careful decision making actually looks like. So those are 10 things that you're allowed to say. And I want to come back to where we started because this whole episode is about permission. Permission to say what you actually think and feel and need in that room, even when it's uncomfortable and even when you're not sure how it will be received. And I know that knowing something and actually doing it in the moment are two very different things. A lot of us go blank in appointments. You know, you've prepared, you know what you want to say, and then you're in the room and then it just doesn't come out. So if that's you, write it down before you go. Have it on your phone or a piece of paper. Ask your husband or a friend to say it for you if you need to. You don't have to be articulate under pressure. You and your husband have been given a real responsibility over real decisions, practically, personally, and before God. And part of honouring that is being honest with the people who are looking after you. That doesn't mean every appointment will go the way you hope. It doesn't mean that every doctor will respond well, but it does mean that you walked in prepared and you gave yourself the chance to say what's needed to be said. I really hope this episode was helpful today, and I'll see you next week. Bye. Before you go, thank you so much for listening. I pray today's episode has brought you fresh hope for whatever comes next. If someone comes to mind today who could truly use support in this space, please share this episode or the podcast with them. It might be exactly what they need. And if you could take 30 seconds to give me a star rating or leave 1 or 2 sentences about what this podcast has meant to you on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, I'd be ever so grateful. Your feedback not only helps others find the podcast, but it truly makes my day. And words of affirmation are my love language. And if you're not sure how to do that, I'll pop the links in the show notes below. Lastly, although I do have a nursing degree, everything shared in this podcast is for inspiration and education only. Please don't use it as a replacement for advice from your personal, medical or mental health professional. There's absolutely no shame in getting additional support when you need it, but always consult your expert team before making any changes to your fertility journey. That's all from me today. Take care and I'll catch you next time. Bye.